You seem distracted, my lord. Perhaps I might ease your mind.
That is quite enough. There is nothing to discuss. Pay her no mind, dearest.
Blood is thicker than water. It's also stickier, heavier, and leaves a stain that never quite washes out. When my sister walked into my engagement dinner, she didn't bring congratulations. She brought matches. She thought she could burn my future to the ground. She didn't account for him. Drafts in Marston Hall did not politely whisper through the cracks. They howled. Margot sat at the far end of the mahogany dining table, her fingers wrapped around the stem of her wine glass. The silver base felt cold, slick with condensation. The dining room smelled heavily of roasted parsnips, dripping mutton fat, and the sharp, medicinal tang of beeswax polish. It was not a romantic setting. There were no violins, no sweeping declarations of eternal devotion. There was only the rhythmic clinking of heavy silver cutlery against porcelain, and the low, steady crackle of the hearth behind her. And yet, Margot had never felt more anchored. Across the table sat Felix, the Duke of Marston. He was not a man built for poetry. His shoulders were broad, straining the seams of a dark, unornamented charcoal coat. He had a smudge of ledger ink on his left thumb, a detail Margot found inexplicably grounding. He chewed his meat slowly, his eyes fixed on a spot just above her left shoulder, deep in thought. They had been discussing crop yields and tenant repairs for the past hour. It was a transactional marriage, born of mutual exhaustion. He needed a duchess who wouldn't bankrupt him with dressmaker bills. She needed a sanctuary away from the suffocating shadows of her family's estate. But somewhere between negotiating dowries and debating the necessity of a new copper roof for the East Wing, a quiet, fragile truce had formed between them, a shared silence that felt a lot like safety. Margot pressed her thumbnail into the side of her index finger, a nervous habit she'd carried since childhood. She was 26, a spinster by society's brutal arithmetic. Her dress was a sensible, heavy dark blue wool that scratched slightly at the collarbone. She was ordinary. She knew this. Felix knew this. They were comfortable with the ordinary. Then, the heavy oak doors of the dining room slammed open. The sound was like a gunshot in the cavernous room. The draft that followed snuffed out 3 of the candelabra nearest the entrance, plunging the lower half of the table into shadows. Margot didn't just startle. Her elbow jerked, knocking her wine glass. It didn't tip over, but dark red liquid sloshed violently against the rim, a single drop spilling onto the pristine white tablecloth like a fresh wound. Well, isn't this overwhelmingly grim? The voice was high, melodic, and drenched in artificial sunshine. Margot's stomach did not drop. It liquefied. A sudden, cold sweat broke out along the nape of her neck. The taste of copper flooded her mouth. She had bitten the inside of her cheek. Lucille. She stood in the doorway, a vision in crushed gold velvet and damp, rosy cheeks. At 22, Lucille was everything Margot was not. Radiant, effortless, the kind of beautiful that made people trip over their own feet. She brought the scent of heavy jasmine and rain-dampened silk into the room, obliterating the humble smells of the dinner. Felix stopped chewing. He did not drop his fork. He simply turned his head, his dark brows knitting together in a slow, deliberate scowl. "Surprise," Lucille announced, stepping into the room and peeling off a pair of cream leather gloves. She tossed them carelessly onto a side table where they knocked over a silver candlestick. She didn't notice. She was already floating toward the table, her eyes locked dead on Felix. The house party at the Danburys was an absolute morgue. I told Father I simply had to come see my dear sister and offer my congratulations in person. I rode through the drizzle. Margot tried to speak. She opened her mouth, but her throat had seized. It was a visceral, humiliating reaction. The familiar paralysis of being the older, uglier, duller sister crept up her spine. She wasn't the future Duchess of Marston right now. She was 12 years old again, standing in the mud while Lucille charmed the riding instructor out of scolding her for stealing Margot's horse. "Lucille." Margot finally managed, her voice thin, reedy, and pathetically small. You didn't send a letter." "Oh, letters are so tedious, darling," Lucille laughed, rounding the table. She didn't go to Margot. She went straight to Felix. She stopped exactly one step too close to his chair. Margot watched, her chest tight, as Lucille tilted her head, exposing the long, elegant line of her neck. "Your Grace," Lucille murmured, her voice dropping an octave, slipping into a breathy register that made Margot's fingernails dig deeper into her own skin. "I do hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I'm afraid I am notoriously impulsive." "A terrible flaw," Father says. Felix looked at her. He didn't stand. Protocol dictated he should rise for a lady, but he remained seated, his large frame completely still. He looked from Lucille's face, down to the hem of her gown, and back up again. "You are dripping on the floorboards," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, flat, completely devoid of the flustered charm most men exhibited when Lucille turned her spotlight on them. Lucille blinked, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before roaring back to life. "Oh, the rain. Yes, a small price to pay for family. Wouldn't you agree?" She didn't wait for an answer. Without being invited, she reached out, dragged a heavy mahogany chair from the side, and wedged it right next to Felix's at the head of the table. She squeezed herself into the space, completely disrupting the balanced geometry of the room. She was now seated between Felix and Margot. A physical barrier. A golden wall. Margot stared at the congealing mutton fat on her plate. The scratching of the wool at her collarbone suddenly felt suffocating. The sanctuary was breached. The illusion was over. Lucille had arrived to do what she always did. Take the shiny thing, break it, and leave Margot with the pieces. The next 20 minutes were an agonizing masterclass in sabotage. Margot dissociated. She sat rigidly in her chair, her eyes tracing the grain of the wood on the table, counting the dark rings. 1, 2, 3. If she focused hard enough on the wood, maybe she wouldn't hear the bright, relentless trill of her sister's laughter. A servant had hastily set a place for Lucille. She hadn't touched the food. Instead, she leaned heavily on her elbows, angling her body so her back was half turned to Margot, effectively cutting her out of the conversation. "I must confess, Your Grace," Lucille sighed, swirling the wine in her newly filled glass. "When Father told me Margot had secured a duke, I nearly fell out of my chair. We were all so surprised." Margot stopped counting the wood grains. Her breath hitched. There it was, the opening volley. "Surprised?" Felix asked. He was holding a glass of water, tracing the rim with that ink-stained thumb. He hadn't looked at Margot since Lucille sat down. Margot felt a hollow, sickening ache in her ribs. He was listening to her. They always listened to Lucille. "Well, you must understand." Lucille laughed, a conspiratorial, intimate sound. She leaned closer to Felix, the scent of jasmine growing oppressive. "Margot is so quiet. She's terribly domestic. When we were girls, I was out climbing trees and breaking the grooms' hearts, and Margot was always in the corner darning socks, or something equally tragic. We used to tease her that she'd end up marrying the vicar." Margot felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands shook under the table, so she gripped the fabric of her skirt until her knuckles turned white. It wasn't a lie. She had darned socks. She had hidden from the loud, chaotic parties her parents threw because the noise made her anxious. She had been terrified of the grooms. Lucille took Margot's quiet nature, her desire for peace, and weaponized it into pathetic spinsterhood. "The vicar," Felix repeated. His tone was unreadable. "Oh, yes," Lucille continued, emboldened by his response. She reached across the table, her hand hovering over Felix's forearm, not quite touching, but close enough to imply intimacy. "She's terribly frightened of society. At my debut ball, she hid in the cloakroom for 3 hours because a baron asked her to dance. Poor thing has the nerves of a frightened field mouse. I just hope," Lucille lowered her voice to a faux sympathetic whisper, "that managing a ducal estate won't overwhelm her. It is such a massive undertaking, and Margot gets flustered so easily. It was a brilliant, venomous piece of theater. To anyone else, it sounded like the genuine concern of a loving sister. But Margot knew the code. She is weak, she is boring, she is an embarrassment. Look at me instead. I am strong. I am vibrant. I am capable. Margot wanted to defend herself. She wanted to say, I didn't hide in the cloakroom. I was fixing the tear in your gown that you ripped while tumbling in the gardens with a lieutenant. But the words died in her throat. The trauma of 20 years of being overshadowed sat heavy on her chest. She had learned long ago that fighting Lucille only made Margot look bitter and unhinged. Lucille was water. She flowed around every accusation and left you drowning. So, Margot stayed silent. She closed her eyes for a brief second, feeling the inevitable slip. The engagement would break. Felix would realize he was marrying a frightened field mouse. He would look at the golden sister, realize he had settled for the dregs, and politely dissolve the contract by morning. Actually, speaking of writing, Lucille pivoted smoothly, sensing she had laid enough groundwork. She casually reached out and picked up Felix's wine goblet, not her own, but his. She took a sip, leaving a faint smudge of lip rouge on the crystal. It was an incredibly intimate, boundary-shattering gesture. I noticed your stables on the way in. I am an avid equestrian. Margot is terrified of horses, of course, but I practically live in the saddle. Perhaps tomorrow you could show me the grounds? I'm told your thoroughbreds are legendary. Margot stared at the smudge of rouge on Felix's glass. The room felt entirely too hot. The fire was roaring now, casting long, flickering shadows across the ceiling. She felt slightly nauseous. The smell of the jasmine was mixing with the roasted meat, turning her stomach. She wanted to run. She wanted to excuse herself, go up to her sensible, cold guest room, pack her sensible wool dresses, and leave before the final humiliation. She shifted her weight, preparing to push her chair back. She would cite a headache. She would retreat. As always, "Are you finished?" The voice cut through the heavy air like a rusted blade. Margot froze. Lucille stopped, the goblet halfway to her lips again. She blinked, her perfect brow furrowing. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace?" Felix finally turned his head. He didn't look charmed. He didn't look amused. He looked down at Lucille with the exact same expression he had used earlier when examining a patch of rot on the floorboards of the East Wing. "Are you finished talking?" Felix asked again. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The sheer dense gravity of his tone sucked all the air out of Lucille's performance. Lucille offered a hesitant, breathy laugh, sensing a shift, but not quite understanding the terrain. "Well, I was only making conversation." "You were making a draft," Felix interrupted flatly, "and you are drinking from my glass." The silence that followed was absolute. Margot stopped breathing. The only sound in the room was the crackle of the hearth and the violent ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Lucille stared at him, her lips parted in genuine shock. A dark, ugly flush began to creep up her pale neck, clashing violently with her rosy cheeks. Slowly, mechanically, she lowered the goblet back to the table. I apologize. I thought we were quite informal." "We are not," Felix said. He didn't soften the blow with a smile. He simply reached forward, picked up the goblet by the stem, and placed it deliberately out of Lucille's reach, pushing it toward the center of the table. He then pulled a crisp linen napkin from his lap and calmly, methodically, wiped the table where the base of the glass had left a ring of moisture. Lucille looked as though she had been slapped. The golden aura around her seemed to flicker and dim. For the first time in her life, her charm had hit a solid, impenetrable wall. Felix didn't linger on her humiliation. He dismissed her entirely. He turned his broad shoulders, shifting his massive frame in the chair so his back was now angled toward Lucille. He looked across the long expanse of the table straight at Margot. Margot's heart gave a violent, painful thud. She met his eyes. They were dark, steady, and utterly clear. "Margot," Felix said, his voice dropping the icy edge, returning to the low, conversational rumble they had shared before the intrusion. "Before we were interrupted, you were mentioning the discrepancies in the tenant ledgers from the lower valley." Margot blinked. Her mind was spinning. He wasn't looking at Lucille. He was asking about ledgers. Yes," she stammered, her voice raspy. She swallowed hard, trying to find her footing. "The lower valley. Yes. I noticed that the grain yields didn't match the storage reports from the winter of 24. Exactly. Felix nodded, resting his elbows on the table and leaning toward her, closing the distance between them. I missed that entirely. My steward is either incompetent or stealing. I suspect the latter. I'd like you to review the books for the Northern Farms tomorrow morning. I trust your eyes more than his. Margot felt a strange, warm sensation bloom in her chest. It wasn't butterflies. It was respect. It was validation. He wasn't just tolerating her. He was weaponizing her competence against Lucille's frivolity. Lucille, unable to bear being sidelined, tried to force her way back in. She leaned forward, practically shouting over Felix's shoulder. Ledgers? Good heavens, Margot, you will bore his grace to tears. Surely you don't intend to spend your engagement hunched over dusty books. Felix didn't turn around. He didn't even look at Lucille. He kept his eyes locked on Margot and spoke without missing a beat. Lady Lucille, he said, his voice dropping into a register that made the fine hairs on Margot's arms stand up. If I wished to be entertained by mindless chatter and performative writing stories, I would visit a circus. I am marrying your sister because she has a mind, a spine, and the rare ability to sit in a room without demanding everyone look at her. Lucille gasped. It was a sharp, ugly sound. Furthermore, Felix continued, finally shifting his gaze just enough to look at Lucille out of the corner of his eye. If you ever speak of my future wife in that condescending tone within my walls again, you will find yourself riding your thoroughbred back into the rain. Is that understood? Margot's hands unspooled beneath the table. The grip she had on her wool skirt relaxed. She felt the blood rushing back to her fingers. Lucille's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. The flush had reached her hairline. Stripped of her charm, denied her audience, she looked suddenly very small and very young. I meant no offense, she whispered, the bravado entirely gone. Then you are simply careless, Felix replied indifferently. He turned back to Margot. The hard lines of his face softened infinitesimally. He reached out, extending his large, ink-stained hand across the polished mahogany. It was a long table. He couldn't quite reach her hand, but he rested his fingertips on the wood, a few inches from her plate. It was a bridge. The Northern Farms, he prompted gently, ignoring the quiet sound of Lucille pushing her chair back, the scrape of the wood sounding like a retreat. Margot looked at his hand. The knuckles were a little rough. She inhaled, and for the first time since the doors had blown open, she didn't smell jasmine. She smelled beeswax. She smelled rain on wool. She smelled her future. The Northern Farms, Margot said, her voice steady, clear, and finally her own. I will need the quarterly report sent to my study after breakfast. Felix's lips twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but in the flickering candlelight, it was the most beautiful thing Margot had ever seen. Consider it done. Rain lashed against the leaded window panes of the guest chamber, sounding like handfuls of gravel thrown by an angry ghost. Margot lay perfectly rigid beneath a mountain of heavy goose-down quilts. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a fragile, glowing skeleton of ash, emitting a faint hiss whenever a stray drop of water found its way down the chimney. The room was freezing. Her toes were numb. Yet her mind was violently, uncomfortably awake. She stared at the plaster moldings on the ceiling, barely visible in the gloom. The adrenaline from the dining room had long since metabolized, leaving behind a hollow, vibrating exhaustion. She replayed the evening over and over. She analyzed the angle of Felix's jaw, the flat, deadpan delivery of his defense, the humiliated slump of Lucille's usually perfect shoulders. It felt like a trap. 26 years of conditioning did not evaporate because a man scolded her sister over a mahogany table. Margot knew how the world worked. Men were creatures of visual appetite. They liked shiny things. They always eventually went back for the shiny things once the novelty of the sensible thing wore off. Felix had defended her tonight, yes. He had drawn a line in the sand. But tomorrow, in the cold, unforgiving light of day, when he saw Lucille standing in the courtyard, her golden hair catching the morning sun, looking fragile and contrite, Margot squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the heels of her hands against her eyelids until sparks of static exploded in her vision. She hated this cynical rot in her brain. She hated that she couldn't just accept a victory. She was waiting for the other boot to drop, because the other boot always dropped. She threw off the covers. The sudden exposure to the frigid air of the room made her gasp, a sharp, ugly sound in the quiet space. She dragged her woolen wrapper from the foot of the bed, shoving her arms into the sleeves and tying the sash in a brutal, tight knot. She shoved her feet into hard-soled leather slippers. If she was going to be awake, she was not going to do it staring at the ceiling, waiting to be discarded. She stepped out into the corridor. Marston Hall at night was not a place for the faint of heart. It groaned. The ancient timber-framed walls settled with loud cracking protests against the dropping temperature. The air smelled of cold stone, damp wool, and centuries of dust. There were no gas lamps lit here, only the weak, watery light of the moon bleeding through the high-arched windows. Margot walked, wrapping her arms tightly around her ribs. She didn't have a destination in mind, only a desperate need for forward momentum. She passed the portrait gallery, ignoring the painted eyes of dead dukes and duchesses. She passed the closed door of Lucille's assigned chamber, noting with a bitter twist of her mouth that no light leaked from beneath it. Lucille was likely sleeping like a baby. People without a conscience usually did. At the end of the east corridor, a sliver of warm, yellow light spilled across the Persian runner. It came from the door to the estate study. It was slightly ajar. Margot stopped. She held her breath, listening. The rhythmic, heavy sound of rain hitting the terrace was the only noise. No voices, no movement. She stepped closer, her leather slippers making absolutely no sound on the thick wool of the carpet. She peered through the crack. Felix sat at the massive oak desk. The fire behind him was roaring, casting a halo of deep orange light over his broad shoulders. He had shed the formal charcoal coat. He was in his shirt sleeves, the white linen stark against the dark-paneled walls. His cravat was gone, the collar of his shirt unbuttoned, revealing a triangle of dark hair and pale skin at his throat. He had a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose, and his hair, usually perfectly slicked back, was rumpled, as if he had run his hands through it a dozen times. He was surrounded by paper, stacks of bound ledgers, loose sheets of parchment, and unfurled maps covered every inch of the desk. He held a steel-nibbed pen, scratching numbers onto a fresh sheet with aggressive, stabbing motions. He looked exhausted. He looked burdened. He looked entirely real. Margot pushed the door open. The hinges gave a soft, metallic groan. Felix didn't jump. He simply stopped writing. He kept his eyes on the paper for a full 3 seconds before slowly lifting his head. The spectacles caught the firelight, obscuring his eyes for a moment before he lowered his chin to look at her over the rims. "It is 3 a.m, he stated. His voice was thick with fatigue, entirely stripped of the formal cadence he used in daylight. "The rain," Margot said. It was a lie. Her voice was raspy, dry from the cold air. She stepped fully into the room, crossing the threshold from the freezing hall into the stifling heat of the study. It smelled of burning peat, stale coffee, and the sharp metallic tang of fresh iron gall ink. Felix looked at her wrapper. He looked at her unpinned hair, which hung in a dull, frizzy curtain over her shoulders. He didn't offer a compliment. He didn't tell her she looked beautiful in the firelight, because she didn't, and they both knew it. "The northern farm ledgers are a disaster," he said flatly, dropping the pen. It hit the wood with a sharp clatter. He pinched the bridge of his nose, pushing the spectacles up slightly. "You were right. The grain yields don't match the storage reports, but it goes deeper. The timber contracts from the spring are missing entirely. Either the steward is lining his pockets, or he's selling the wood to cover gambling debts. I can't figure out the cipher he's using in the margins." Margot walked slowly toward the desk. The heat from the fire hit her back, seeping through the heavy wool of her wrapper. She stopped opposite him, looking down at the chaotic spread of papers. "May I?" she asked. He gestured vaguely with one large hand. "If you want to ruin your eyesight, be my guest." Margot pulled a heavy leather chair closer to the edge of the desk. She sat, pulling the ledger he had been scrutinizing toward her. The paper was rough under her fingertips. The ink was a faded brownish black, the handwriting cramped and frantic. She recognized the chaotic energy of someone trying to hide something. She leaned over the book. The smell of the old parchment and binding glue filled her nose, anchoring her. She scanned the columns. Numbers were safe. Numbers didn't lie, they didn't manipulate, and they didn't wear crushed gold velvet. "He's not using a cipher," Margot murmured, her eyes tracing a line of expenditures. She reached out instinctively, taking the steel pen from where Felix had dropped it. The metal was still warm from his grip. She dipped it into the glass inkwell, ignoring the way Felix shifted his chair closer to watch her. "Look here," she pointed with the tip of the pen, leaving a tiny dot of black ink on the page. "He's listing the timber shipments under livestock feed. He's shifting the decimal points. 10 cartloads of oak become 100 bushels of oats. He balances the outgoing inventory with fake incoming feed, which, of course, the animals never eat." Felix leaned over. His shoulder brushed against hers. The physical contact was minimal, just the heavy linen of his shirt against the rough wool of her wrapper, but it felt like a jolt of electricity. He smelled of cedarwood, soap, and male sweat. It was entirely unromantic and violently intimate. He stared at the page, his eyes tracking her pen as she drew a line connecting the false timber entries to the exaggerated feed costs. He was silent for a long time. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked, a heavy, relentless sound. "I am an idiot," Felix finally said, his voice a low, self-deprecating rumble. "I've been staring at this for 4 hours." "You aren't an idiot," Margot replied, not looking up. She kept her eyes glued to the numbers, terrified that if she looked at him she would lose her nerve. "You are looking at it like a duke. You expect grand theft, treason, complex embezzlement ciphers. This is the theft of a desperate, unimaginative man." Felix let out a short, breathy huff. It might have been a laugh. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. He looked at her. Margot could feel the weight of his gaze on the side of her face. She kept her jaw locked, turning the page with agonizing slowness. "Your sister is very beautiful," Felix said softly. The words hit Margot like a physical blow. Her hand froze. The pen hovered over the paper, a drop of ink swelling at the nib, threatening to fall and ruin the ledger. Her chest tightened so painfully she thought her ribs might crack. There it was, the boot dropping, the inevitable pivot. She swallowed the thick, bitter lump in her throat. She didn't look at him. She carefully set the pen down on the silver rest. "Yes, she is. Everyone says so." "She is entirely aware of it, too," Felix continued, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "She uses it like a hammer. She expects people to flatten themselves before she even swings." Margot traced the edge of the ledger with her thumbnail. "It usually works." "I am sure it does," Felix agreed. He shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He leaned forward again, resting his forearms on the desk, forcing Margot to look at him or stare at his elbows. She reluctantly dragged her eyes up to meet his. His face was deadly serious. The firelight threw harsh shadows into the hollows of his cheeks. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who smile at me because of my title," Felix said, his voice dropping into a register that commanded total terrifying focus. "I have dealt with sycophants, flatterers, and beautiful people who have absolutely nothing behind their eyes except a calculation of what I can do for them. I am tired, Margot. I am deeply, fundamentally tired of noise." Margot gripped her own knees under the desk. She didn't know what to say. This wasn't a conversation she was prepared for. "When I proposed this arrangement," he continued, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she refused to. "I told your father I wanted a partner. I didn't want a show pony. I didn't want an ornament for my drawing room. I wanted someone who could look at a rotting floorboard and tell me exactly how much it will cost to fix it. I wanted someone who wouldn't flinch when the roof leaks." He reached out. He didn't grab her hand. He pressed his palm flat against the desk, right next to the ledger she was holding. Your sister blew into my dining room tonight and tried to sell me a fantasy, Felix said, his lip curling slightly in disgust. She tried to sell me the exact same exhausting, performative nonsense I come out to the country to escape, and she expected me to buy it because she thinks I am weak. She thinks men are weak. Margot stared at his hand. The ink smudge was still there on his thumb. Most men are, she whispered, the cynicism bleeding through despite her best efforts. Perhaps Felix allowed, but I am not marrying her. I am marrying the woman who found a decimal error at 3 a.m. in a freezing study. He pulled his hand back, sitting up straight. The intense, suffocating closeness broke, allowing Margot to drag a ragged breath into her lungs. Go to bed, Margot, he said, his tone shifting back to the practical, authoritative Duke. He picked up his pen. We will fire the steward after breakfast. I need you rested. We have an estate to run. Margot stood up. Her legs felt weak, trembling slightly under the heavy wool. She looked at him, really looked at him, at his messy hair, his tired eyes, his brutal, unyielding honesty. He wasn't a knight in shining armor. He was a tired man with a ruined ledger, and he wanted her, not despite her practicality, but because of it. Good night, Felix, she said quietly. He didn't look up from the paper, but his pen paused for a fraction of a second. Good night, Margot. She walked back to her room. The corridor didn't feel quite so cold. The shadows didn't seem quite so heavy. When she finally climbed back under the goose-down quilts, she didn't stare at the ceiling. She closed her eyes, breathing in the lingering scent of iron gall ink on her fingers, and for the first time in 26 years, she slept deeply, entirely free of dreams about her sister. Gray light bled into Marston Hall with the brutal efficiency of a wet autumn morning. Rain battered the leaded glass, transforming the courtyard into a muddy mess of crushed stone. Inside the breakfast parlor, the hearth fire sputtered against the damp draft bleeding through the window casings. The air held the sharp bite of wood smoke mixed with the dark aroma of roasted coffee. Margot sat at a scarred oak table near the window. She wore a dark green morning dress, buttoned securely to her collarbone. The wool dragged against her skin, a constant friction that felt strangely grounding. She gripped a cup of black tea, the thick porcelain retaining heat against her palms. Her eyes burned with the ache of a sleepless night spent hunting decimal points in freezing ledgers. Yet the persistent knot of anxiety that had lived beneath her ribs for 26 years was gone. In its place rested a heavy, solid exhaustion. It was the satisfying fatigue of a laborer. She traced a scratch in the wood, marveling at the quiet. Footsteps sounded in the corridor, heavy, deliberate, unhurried. Felix walked into the parlor wearing riding leathers. The damp material carried the earthy stench of the stables, wet horsehair, and saddle soap. He did not offer a polite greeting. He walked directly to the sideboard, poured black coffee, and took cold toast from a wire rack. He pulled out the chair opposite Margot. The wooden legs shrieked aggressively against the floorboards. The steward is packing his bags, Felix stated, chewing methodically, staring at the grain of the table. I gave him 1 hour to vacate. I informed him that if I ever caught him on my lands again, the magistrate would drag him through the village in irons. Margot blew on the dark surface of her tea. Did he confess to the cipher? He wept, Felix said, his voice devoid of pity. He blamed the stablemaster. When I showed him the false feed receipts, his knees gave out. He collapsed against the desk. It was a pathetic display. You saved the estate a fortune, Margot. It was just addition, she replied. It was competence, he corrected, lifting his eyes to meet hers. The parlor door opened. The iron hinges whined in dull protest. Lucille stood on the threshold. The radiant aura of the previous evening had been violently extinguished. She wore a severe, burgundy traveling gown, her hair scraped back ruthlessly beneath a rigid leather bonnet. Stripped of her crushed velvet, she looked shockingly ordinary. Her skin was sallow, pulling tightly across her cheekbones. She gripped riding gloves with white-knuckled desperation, her chest heaving slightly. Neither Felix nor Margot rose. "Good morning," Lucille announced. The musical trill had cracked, masking a frantic panic. Felix did not look up. "Lady Lucille, I noted your trunks being loaded into the carriage. An early departure. It was a brutal confirmation of her eviction. Lucille swallowed hard. A dark flush crept up her throat. A courier arrived at dawn. She lied. The desperation was palpable. Everyone knew the roads were impassable for night couriers. Father sent word. An emergency regarding the southern tenant leases. He requires my immediate presence. Margot watched her sister, feeling a profound, hollow shock. She had spent a lifetime terrified of this woman, letting Lucille's chaotic energy dictate her worth. Now, looking at the golden girl grasping at transparent lies, Margot felt nothing but distant, sterile pity. Tragic, Felix murmured, turning a page of a leather notebook. I trust your expertise in tenant leases equals your knowledge of my thoroughbreds. Lucille flinched. Denied her charms, she turned her venom toward the only target she had ever successfully hit. I hope you find this damp tomb to your liking, Margot, Lucille spat, her voice dropping into a vicious whisper. I hope you enjoy your ledgers. You belong with the dust. Margot set her teacup down, the porcelain clinking with finality. She did not break eye contact. I rather like the dust, Lucille, Margot said softly. Dust is honest. It settles exactly where it belongs. It never pretends to be gold. Lucille staggered back, struck by the absence of fear. She searched Margot's face for the familiar flinch and found a stone wall. Unable to bear the reflection of her own insignificance, Lucille turned on her heel. She practically ran from the parlor, slamming the door shut. Outside, the iron-banded wheels of the ducal carriage ground violently against the wet gravel. A whip cracked, echoing off the courtyard walls. Margot watched impassively as the carriage tore through the rain, disappearing down the mist-swallowed avenue. The phantom hands that had gripped her throat for decades dissolved. Felix finished his coffee. He stood up, towering over the table. The east wing roof is scheduled for a slate inspection at 10 o'clock, Felix said, shifting immediately back to the grueling reality of estate management. The contractor is a swindler. He attempts to overcharge on the square footage. Margot picked up her cold tea. She drank it anyway, liking the sharp, biting taste. I will bring the previous seasonal invoices to the courtyard, Margot replied, her voice ringing with quiet authority. If he attempts to inflate the slate costs, we will remind him of the discrepancy in the copper flashing he installed last spring. Felix paused at the door. He turned back. The harsh lines of his face relaxed, and a rare, barely perceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a shared secret in the gray light. I pity the man, Felix murmured. He walked out. Margot remained at the table. She looked down at her hands, observing a faint smudge of iron gall ink clinging to her thumb. There were no violins playing. There were no sweeping vows. There were only ledgers, swindling contractors, and cold tea. She traced the rim of her cup, an unapologetic smile breaking across her face. It was going to be an absolutely magnificent life. If you've ever felt like the secondary character in your own life, you know exactly how heavy that burden is. Margot's quiet victory isn't about dramatic revenge. It's about finally being seen by someone who values substance over shine. If this grounded, raw moment resonated with you, drop a like, share this story with someone who needs a reminder of their worth, and subscribe for more deeply human historical dramas. What would you do in Margot's shoes? Tell me.